to be, if you don't want to kind of be seen in the recording, also switch off your camera, please. We want it to be really interactive. So if you do want to kind of comment and share your point of view, if you raise your hands, then we'll be able to come over to you. Failing that, please use the chat box, of course. Pose any questions, leave your comments, and then we'll follow up with any of those post this workshop. So on that note, we'll make a start because we've only got an hour, and I'm hoping, based on the agenda, to kind of have a really rich discussion. So a big welcome, first of all, to the first in the series of policy labs hosted by Newham Council. Noel will kind of give you the context of the piece of work we're kind of embarking on for a very short while. This is the way of an introduction to myself, and I'll be facilitating this and future workshops. My name's Dr Darren Sharpe, and I'm a UCL CAPE Policy Fellow embedded in Newham Council, working alongside Noel and his team. So CAPE stands for Capabilities in Academic Policy Engagement. So it's a bit of a mouthful, actually. But in essence, what it's trying to do is improve the knowledge transfer and the relationship between academia and the policy world, be it local government or national government. So there's a number of CAPE policy fellows scattered across the country among several different institutions. My role in supporting Noel at Newham is developing a new participation strategy, or developing or renewing the existing participation strategy. As part of that, we are open to a series of workshops, this being workshop 1, and hopefully it will be mutually beneficial, as well as obviously at Newham and ourselves learning from your experiences and your challenge. We're hoping through the rich discussion that you'll equally take from this space and also renew, review and update your own participation strategy. So although I've been quite a tight agenda, this is really kind of a brown bag space. It's informal and it's about learning and sharing at its most basic, really. So that is the kind of spirit and tone of this space. The structure is like a dual workshop, really. How we've planned the sequence of workshops. Workshop 1 always begins with the problem, so identifying and bounding what your specific problem is as it relates to engaging residents in policy making. And then the second workshop, what follows, always looks at the solution. So we aren't trying to cram both the problem and the solution within one workshop. There'll be plenty of time to kind of explore both dimensions. To help kind of stimulate the discussion, we've also got colleagues from Newham Council, and they will be sharing some of their insights and some of their challenges, both in the problem workshops and hopefully going forward in the solution workshops as well. And so that is the kind of the flow, structure and the purpose behind this initial policy. So if I hand over to Noel, who'll give you a bit more context about what this programme of work is really about and the role of Newham.
Thank you very much, Darren. Just out of context, at Newham, as with other councils and organisations, we're trying to improve how we involve residents in policy making. And there are kind of a number of ways that we do that, including citizens assemblies, community assemblies that you'll hear about in a moment, as well as supporting residents to carry out research in their communities. But one thing we do want to do is to kind of help the organisation and work with services to make sure that in every experience that residents have in trying to influence kind of the way the council does things, and in particular in terms of policy making, that there's high quality participation, and that's kind of partly why we brought in Darren and his kind of expertise in facilitating these sessions, so that we can kind of get innovative practice from outside, as well as the work that we've been doing with residents to develop a participation framework. So a framework of how we can do consistently good kind of participation and use different methods to achieve that. So this is the start of a series of workshops, and really looking forward to the interactive exercises and the kind of the topics that we get into.
Great, thank you, Noel. And so in terms of what we'll be kind of looking at today, it's really focused around three key areas. People, so in terms of our communities, who are the people who are least engaging, or it's more challenging to engage, or the marginalised voices, to phrase it a different way. The second is about places, so isolated and lonely places. Is there sections of your community that, again, you find it difficult and challenging to engage when it comes to policy making? And third is looking really at participation methods, mechanisms, structures or tools. What isn't working as opposed to what is working? So they're the three kind of areas we'll be exploring today. To begin with, I'm going to put up a meta-meter. So I'm going to ask you all to actually log in. You'll see the link very shortly. And if you can just consider by yourself and record which groups of people have you found most difficult to engage in policy making. So I'll just give you a few minutes. And so if you follow the instructions right at the top, you can do this on your mobile or on your PC. Just open a new browser. And if you type in www.meti.com, and then you'll see a space where you can insert the code, and it should take you straight to this question. Thank you, Noel. That's very interesting. And based upon the number of responses what are identical, the larger, obviously, the lettering. So we can see clearly that young people are predominantly the common group, which are harder to engage. Okay, I'll just give you just the last 10 seconds to write down your response. So if I can kindly jump over to Noel and just really using Newham as a case example, in terms of engagement in policy making, Noel, how would you summarise Newham and Newham's challenges in terms of its demographics?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So Newham's kind of very diverse communities. We're probably the most diverse kind of borough in the country, with 7 in 10 people from a non-white background, and actually there are kind of different groups that we work with to engage the kind of those different communities. But I'd say one of the communities that's most difficult to engage with is people working in kind of what might be called the informal or the gig economy. Because while we can take representative ways to engage different people depending on their demographics, there are people that are just through the nature of their work are really difficult to engage. And that's particularly for transient people as well. And then people for whom have very limited rights in this country, unfortunately, such as asylum seekers, for whom there's also kind of an additional fear when you're kind of engaging with the state. Also kind of makes it difficult to engage in the policy making mechanisms that kind of otherwise work for kind of other demographics and other groups.
No, thank you, Noel. And non-registered residents came up actually in a discussion I was having yesterday as part of a Cape Fellowship, which is it's not just new and clearly, it's a much more wider and broader concern when it comes to engagement. Going and jumping back into the word cloud, young people came up quite predominantly. Somebody who wrote young people, do you mind just explaining your context and why it's a challenge from your context? Any great volunteer?
I wrote down young people.
Can you expand why young people, and is it a certain group of young person?
Yes, I'm supposed to engage adolescents from 15 to 18 years old in a participatory project in Wallonia, the south of Belgium, and we found it really hard to engage them to this project, mainly because we're supposed to analyze the COVID crisis and learn from the COVID crisis how to handle future crises. And there's a fatigue about talking. There's a fatigue linked to talking about COVID, but there's also the difficulty to engage with that particular group of age that has other centers of interest that they are not really into entering in dialogue with the institutions. So it's really difficult for us. Thank you.
And is that being an historical problem, or is it a current problem related to COVID, do you think?
Well, I think it's a double problem. It's a group of age that has other centers of interest and is in another, they're into something else, and mainly because of their age. And also there's a COVID fatigue, and nobody wants to talk about that anymore.
Okay, no, and thank you. And thank you for joining us from Belgium as well. And are you from local government in Belgium?
No, I have a double hat. I'm an activist, but I'm also a consultant working for the public service, and I'm a former public civil
servant.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Did anybody else put down young people? And are there different reasons why you put down young people?
I did. It's Natalie here. Hi. Natalie Savona. I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I did wonder whether, I mean, I'm sure I'm saying something that everyone's familiar with, but it might be that we've all tried to work with young people and found it hard, which is why it's come up bigger than the rest. Excuse me. We're trying to work with young people in 5 European countries looking at obesity, and we thought very hard about why it seemed so hard to engage the young people. And I think one of them was our topic, possibly stigma. Yes. We didn't actually necessarily want to work with people who were classified as overweight in any sense, but the topic we were discussing. And I think the thing with the young people we found particularly difficult was just, they just weren't particularly interested in talking about that. We did find that incentives made a huge difference, which in itself is potentially problematic. So we gave them vouchers for participation as is right for their time, you know, in effect paying for their time, but also is required by a lot of research funders. But then, you know, that leaves lots of questions as to why people might be coming along and the sorts of people who you might get if you did or didn't pay. So I think these are questions that are probably far and wide for all sorts of participation, not just with young people.
Yes.
But we found when we put any meetings in the school day at school, we had a much higher attendance.
Okay.
So I think it's pragmatism as well.
Yeah.
You know, we provided lunch, they came along, it was a bit of a laugh. They got free food. So yeah, lots of different things to think about. I mean, in some ways, I'm sure it was easier than a lot of the other people on that word cloud to engage, because you can find them more easily. Even if they say no, they're easier to find than a lot of the population groups on the word cloud.
Yeah. And so you kind of bridged us into next week's workshop in terms of some of the solutions, in terms of food, working with people in kind of structured timeframes or spaces, as well as offering incentives. So thank you for that. If I noticed, Arlen, you had your hand raised earlier. Did you want to input? So, Jessica?
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to speak to some previous work I did in Southend, which was co-producing carers strategies and wanting to get the voice of young carers.
Yeah.
We tried a couple of different ways, but we linked in with an existing support group that they went to, but it had to be online because of COVID. And what struck me, and has struck me in other participation exercises, is the vulnerability that they're trying to manage within the contributions, and how that's done, and also this sense of pushing as the institution into people's lives and making that very non-extractive. So I think the reciprocity piece is tricky, but it's about, for me, it's about creating what's meaningful for those groups. So that's quite tricky when you're thinking of kind of reward and recognition or reciprocity policies, because it'll be different for different groups.
Yeah.
So those aren't really. I just wanted to kind of flag that because it occurred to me, and how you then take care of. I mean, we had kind of debriefing, and that's why we went through existing. But what struck me is the young carers wanted to perhaps say things, but they found it very difficult in a group. And there was a sense of younger carers wanting to please the adults and sort of filling the space and carrying that load, you know, and I'm not sure I was terribly comfortable with that in some ways, but I think we did manage to get some participation going. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jessica. And it relates back to a discussion myself and Noel had, really, which is kind of stating the obvious, but any strategy there isn't one solution to kind of fix the engagement problem. And you're very right, it's really starting from the individual or the communities to define what would be a good incentive, what would be a good platform for engagement, and starting from that position. I'm conscious of time, but also I just wanted to pull in one final comment in relation to the word cloud. In contrast to young people, what is also quite predominant is middle-aged men. I thought that would be a nice contrasting segment of the population. So did anybody who wrote middle-aged men, if you can briefly explain who you are and why? No, do we have no ownership of middle-aged men?
Hi, I did write middle-aged men and religious minorities. So I come from India. I'm currently in London, but I've worked as a journalist in India. Middle-aged men, because it's just been I don't know. I think it's just probably a personal experience where it was difficult in terms of getting an unbiased view from middle-aged men because of probably their own mental constraints. At least that's my observation in India, and also religious minorities because of a lack of trust in the administration, especially in India, where it's such a there's already such a tense situation in terms of religious minorities. It's very difficult to reach out to religious minorities and get their say and get their views in terms of policy making, because there is no faith or no trust in the administration to kind of make policies in their favor or safeguard them.
No, thank you for that. And you raised some very key points around minorities within minorities, really. What often we neglect when we do engagement. We seem to think that the minority group leaders will speak for that entire community, but there's marginalised voices even within marginalised or minority groups.
That's a big problem in India.
Thank you. And George, I'm conscious you've got your hands raised. If you wanted just to...
Yeah, it wasn't a point around specifically about young people or middle-aged men. Just to say, George Despote is here from Waltham Forest Council in London. So I just, like, based on my experience, definitely the subject plays a big role, as someone mentioned, like COVID and like young people maybe that are like fed up discussing or even thinking about this issue. What I wanted to also add here, based on my experience, it depends on whether you want to discuss the problem as let's understand the problem, or you're in the solution phase. So the same thing, we are in this workshop, like maybe for some people it's more interesting to discuss solutions rather than trying to reflect and think about the problem. I think, the phase of understanding the problem, policymakers trying to understand the lived experience of those kind of complex social issues and how people kind of face it like on their daily lives. I think it's a more kind of difficult discussion sometimes to kind of reflect on how this is kind of affecting me. But equally, some people cannot actually, brainstorm ideas. Like personally, as George, I find it very difficult. If you ask me, let's think about ideas. Like, let's put ideas on a post-it note. I'm a very kind of reflective person, and I need my time. So I think sometimes is like part of the policy making process, depending on where you are. So young people might be, easier for them to kind of engage and participate in like X phase, whereas another group in like an earlier stage, for example. So I'm just throwing that, as a new dimension basically in the mix.
No, and that's really good. It's kind of the pedagogy or the approach of you're literally modelling the challenges residents may face linked to the exercise we're currently doing. And it's not easy for everybody to start at the same place, and that assumption that this will lead to the desired outcome. So it's a very relevant and poignant point to make, George. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move on to the next question. If it enables.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, Darren, but I had my hand up for a little while, and I do want to highlight some of the conversations in the chat about because a lot of people wrote LGBTQI in a different way. It didn't look as big as it would have done if everybody had written in the same way. It would have been bigger than middle-aged men. And I also wanted to highlight a comment Janelle made. I'm from Hackney, by the way, sorry. Janelle made about the issue. One thing that really jumped out with the word cloud that wasn't visible using the format was that how those issues are all intersectional, and it's actually the intersectionality of those issues that makes it hard, not those groups themselves. And I thought it was really important to highlight that, so that we don't miss things when we use tools like word clouds because somebody's written something in a different way. And there was clearly a real difficulty everyone is having with engaging LGBT communities. Sorry to jump in and interrupt, but I did feel it was important to say that.
This is what I want. So thank you. Thank you for doing that and highlighting that intersectionality, which I think is key really to the problem or identifying the problem. People aren't problems per se. It's life experiences and circumstances and how they intersect, which is often the problem. And on that note, the second task really is what we've looked at the people, but what about the places or sections, geographic places, virtual space places where it's difficult in which to engage groups of people? So it's looking at the initial problem, but in a slightly different way. If you can just write and describe the types of places based upon your experiences, what poses challenges for engagement in policy making. So I'll just give you a few minutes just to reflect and then record your thoughts.
Sorry, I do have to leave, so I just wanted to make one point before I left, if would that be possible at all?
Oh, please, yeah, continue talking.
Yeah, no, it's just the whole idea of my background has been in academia and in youth work, and work as a consultant now. So one thing I've found is useful is creating methodologies that are subtle enough to figure out when and how people engage. So rather than using lack of engagement and or participation as a problem, use it as something that actually tells you something. Are there intersections of identity or locations or that where people stop engaging? Because I believe if you've got a methodology that's subtle enough, that should be part of what your analysis phase. But it was just an idea which I've always thought was really useful when working within this. Okay, and if I heard you clearly, really the focus from your perspective should be when people exit engagement. Well, yeah, it's not just the exit engagement that tells you something. Why are they exiting engagement? Would you call it? Is it a certain type of person that always exits engagement at the same point? That should tell you something. What it means is as an individual, as the project which you're doing. But participation isn't I don't know. It's not a commodity. It's a trait. It's a spectrum. So figuring out what that means and what engagement, real engagement, means within that context, I just think is incredibly useful. And sorry, I'm going to have to go now. No, but thank you. No, thank you for joining us. And hopefully see you next week when we look at the solutions. Okay. And so before we go into the locations, what you've supplied, can I go over to Amy and Chris, who coordinate and run the Citizens Assembly in Newham? And if you can just describe, in terms of place, it's a bit of a challenge. In terms of place, what challenges do you find in your work area in relation to engaging residents?
Hi Darren, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can do, Chris.
Amy, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here, Chris.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, great. Yeah, just a quick background. Yeah, we're involved in a participatory budgetary program that's run as an annual cycle, where we invite residents to think of their local priorities and what they would like to sort of change, and we get lots of ideas like greening and safer streets and things like that. So what we try to do is just advertise that out, and one of the challenges, just like everyone mentioned, is just reaching out to as many communities as possible, and what we ask is for people to put project proposals forward that addresses their local priorities. So it might be street plants, planting, greening, gym equipment in the park, that kind of thing. So, and I think one of the barriers there as well is that whole application process. I don't know whether that puts people off, whether forms might be something that people just avoid. So we seem to sort of get the similar sort of applications coming through sort of year in, year out. And it's usually from the same sort of organisations and groups. So one of the things that we will need to look at is trying to find out what are the barriers of people putting forward their ideas. Is there anything we can improve on in terms of how people apply? And also as well to encourage lateral and creative thinking with their ideas as well. So it's not just about just the local kind of vicinity, it's just thinking of the whole overall picture of Newham and how it can develop as a borough as well in the future. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'll just add a couple of things specifically about place. So like Chris mentioned, kind of reaching different communities. I think just really practically as well, we do a lot of promotion out of libraries. We do a lot of events and community centres and things like that. So we're naturally connecting with people that already feel a connection to that local area. So people that we find that there's wards that generally are less represented. And also just to expand on what Chris was saying about kind of the lateral creative thinking. I think kind of there's a bit of a balance of trying to encourage people to think of like the bigger picture and the wider impact. So the community assemblies is a neighbourhood model. So we have 8 Newham split into 8 neighbourhoods, and what's good about that is that people almost don't need to think about the kind of the whole of Newham and all of its different hugely diverse communities that they maybe don't feel that they can relate to. They can think about like these streets that I walk up and down every day and these people that I see every day, like what can kind of contribute to that like really local community, which I think is quite a good balance, because yeah, it can be difficult for people to kind of get out of their own very personal experiences of like, this is something that's going to help me in my day-to-day and think about the wider impact. So that's all I wanted to add.
And also just encouraging, I noticed some really great ideas come through, particularly with those who have skilled knowledge or experience of a particular field like engineering or things like that. So it's like really creative ideas on how to collect water that will automatically, water, flowers and beds and things like that. And it's like engineering ideas, that kind of stuff. So it's encouraging that expertise as well to join us in developing some of these projects.
Yeah. People power, isn't it? Unlocking their assets and making it bear on the local community, definitely. And thank you, Chris and Amy. And I like that notion of kind of, we often talk in population level, but this is really about neighbourhood level or street level, isn't it, really, what you're encouraging in your work. And that relates, I guess, nicely to a couple of the points made in the, not the word cloud this time, but your statements, really. Very transient streets. And so I'd be interested to unpack that a bit more, whoever wrote that. Do you mind telling us what you mean by very transient streets? Who is the owner of that statement?
I will say that wasn't my statement, but I did put on areas of transient population, which I think is the same. So I'll cut in to potentially break an awkward silence. But the issue we have is I'm from London Borough, Barking Dagenham. We have quite large amounts of our population who move in and out within the space of a few years. But that's quite hard for us to engage with, because they're not people who've generally sort of got roots in the community, and therefore with the groups that we would usually engage with, or they're not sort of, they don't receive the newsletters and things where we build up with people who live here for longer, and essentially they don't feel they have as much stake in the area, so they're much less likely to just to engage with any questions we're asking about policy making, because they haven't got that kind of investment in the area.
Yeah. And do you think, just me probing really, are these going back to what Noel said about gig economy workers, or are this part of gentrification? When it relates to these transient residents?
we don't use the G word in Barking and Dagenham, because we are trying to, the amount of building we are doing, we you know, a huge portion of that is going to people who are local, but it's a longer term thing. Even before our building project started, that actually we would be having people moving in for short periods of time, largely because we're one of the cheapest places to live in London. I think that draws people in. I think there might be some assumptions about things, the work people are doing there as well, but we do have young professionals moving here and so on. I wouldn't really know. Again, it's potentially really an unknown, that question at the moment, unless there's anyone else from the borough on the call who has more information on that.
Well, no, thank you for your feedback. And somebody's got their hands raised. Is it Emma or Amy? Emmy?
No, sorry, that's from ages ago. I just forgot to put it down because I'm not used to Teams. Okay. Apologies.
No problem whatsoever. Yeah, and so, okay, so does anybody else really want to speak to their statement? Because, again, there's a number of them on deprived areas or areas of deprivation. Anybody wishes to expand on any of their statements? Estates versus large estates. It wasn't until I actually came in and moved to London from the north, I realised that an estate is actually a tower block that will be classified as an estate in a London borough, as opposed to outside of London, where an estate is more of a geographic area, a collection of houses, flats, and residences. Anybody wants to feedback on their statement? I can see one raised hand. If you want to, who does it belong to?
It belongs to me, Darren. Hi. Hi, thanks for inviting me in. I was the participant that specified large estates, and I think one of the challenges that we found, I'm based in Southwark, is that there are sort of estates within estates and kind of communities and very sort of distinct identities even with some of our very large estates. Yes. And so actually, and also one example that we had was of a particular part of an estate that had a particular issue with a community coming in and using spaces and leaving. And so I think, I suppose, just acknowledging that residents, even when we think about estates, which one might think as a sort of discrete kind of contained space, actually for residents, places within the estate even feel like quite distinct and separate. And something else that I was reflecting on is even when we're defining place and thinking about policy, once you start talking to national government, to the NHS, to community groups, even how we're defining a space or a place varies for ourselves. So trying to have a coordinated and joined up conversation that makes sense to residents when you as institutions have differences of views about, you know, the boundary that you're discussing, it can just make it really challenging for residents to kind of then engage with and understand the conversation. Obviously, this is very much a kind of sort of very London centric view, but I guess it's the London Policy Network, isn't it? So that's all right. But yeah, I think just acknowledging that trying to structure a conversation in a way that makes sense for residents and speaks to their understanding of place and space can be a real challenge. But large estates specifically, just because the residents' experience of those spaces often is quite different to what we might assume as officers, was just something that was on my mind.
No, thank you for that, Beth. And yeah, they're both really key points, really, about how we define space, how we talk about space as a vocabulary. And from a policy context, yeah, we all have different geographic footprints we're kind of bounding our policy within. So we need to square that, or at least recognise it when we talk to residents, who I guess talk about space as own. That would be hopefully their starting point. But it isn't ours necessarily from a policy context. And so a challenge is squaring that. Okay, so thank you for that input. And then now we're going to go on to our third and final slide, which is all about participation methods. So if you bear with me, my mouse is not cooperating. Oops, I've gone too far now. There we go. And so now what we really want to know is, what are the weakest tools or methods you've used to engage and support residents? So I flip this question. Rather than telling me what works, I want to know what doesn't work from your experience. So if I can give you again a few minutes to rate these, and we've got digital tools, we've got assemblies, we've got councils, one-off meetings, what may be leading directly to policy making, citizen scientists, or you can call those co-researchers, co-produced commissioning, resident survey, and there's a host of others. So this isn't an exhaustive list. That's very interesting. So at the top, we can see resident surveys. Oh, okay. That is tying now with one-off meetings, followed by citizens scientists. Okay. I'll just give you just a few more minutes, sorry, a few more seconds just to finish. Oh, digital tools is making an appearance. Councils. Okay, well, again, before we delve into this chart, and please keep on submitting your experience and your views, if I can introduce Clive, who leads our kind of, is it commission and scrutiny groups at Newham?
It is, Darren, and in fact, I think you wanted me to speak about when I got the email, you said commissions, and if it's okay, do you want me to go ahead and talk a little bit about that?
Well, please, yeah, and in the context of its strengths and its weaknesses, I guess, please.
So I translated that word commissions because if you give me one word, I think I have a bit of artistic license there to adjust it to democratic accountability. And in that sense, I wanted to talk a little bit about the overview and scrutiny commissions, their role in democratic accountability, and the challenges potentially that we do face in relation to participation. And I think the challenge that we face is probably not going to be something that you might expect me to say when I get to the end of my short introduction. But just for those who perhaps aren't so clued up with local government governance structures, scrutiny commissions really are like select committees in Parliament. And these overview and scrutiny commissions exist to bring democratic accountability to bear on the executive. In other words, to hold the executive to account. In our case, we hold the mayor and her cabinet to account. But the other thing that these democratic accountability or overview and scrutiny commissions are meant to do is to bring into the democratic accountability space the voice of residents. And it's that aspect which then sort of touches on or connects with the participatory and engagement element. And in relation to the former, I'm going to say we've been relatively successful in holding the executive to account, but we've been very patchy. And in fact, I've been in this space since 2000, when the Local Government Act of 2000 came in, bringing this model of governance into local government. And I'd suggest, with my chair of London Scrutiny Network hat on, former chair of it, that the experience has been patchy across all local government structures, not just Newham. Now, so the former happens, we have some success in accountability, but we struggle to bring participation to bear. We struggle to get residents to participate in this accountability space. So the first challenge is exactly that challenge. We are meant to be engaging. We're meant to bring residents in. Why aren't residents participating in democratic accountability? You'd think that they jump at every opportunity to engage when it comes to holding decision makers to account. But I can tell you with certainty that they don't turn up at our meetings, and they don't participate in our in-depth reviews, thematic reviews, or anything like that. The other question I wanted to bring up was the question of what is democratic accountability and what is the relationship between democratic accountability and participation as envisaged in this democratic accountability space, and participation more generally. And I say that because in working with elected members, politicians, local government politicians across, a number of years, they'll often say to me, well, Clive, we're the elected representatives. What is the Citizens Assembly? What is this focus group? What is this resident survey? What is all of it? We represent the people. And they sometimes seem to think that that might have a special place in participation. So just a question, I'm not saying it is that way or isn't that way. It's just something I've heard. And then I suppose, how do we bridge participatory mechanisms that rely on and depend on elected members versus the entire toolkit of participation? And so I'm going to end with this, is that I think the challenge when it comes to the democratic accountability space isn't what you think it is at face value. And I'm going to suggest that the challenge is that there isn't parity between the executive branch of local government and the accountability branch of local government, that the accountability branch of local government has been under-resourced and treated as a Cinderella for many years, and that the only way to deal with all of the things we've been speaking so far about, and they're all part and parcel of the challenge of participation, in this instance resides in recognition that accountability matters for democracy, that citizen participation and engagement matters as part of that, and therefore adequately resourcing and enabling within local government the accountability function to be adequately resourced is really the first step towards then even for us getting to these other challenges which colleagues across this network have rightly raised. So I'll leave you with all those questions.
No, thank you, Clive. They're a very provocative questions. So although these present the tools in the doing of it, what you've posed are like the fundamentals, what sit behind the tool, which I think is really great. Before we move into actually, and this is all visual, so we can see collectively the challenges in terms of tools, did anybody want to respond to, I guess, the questions what Clive has posed or what Amy's posed earlier and Noel in their sections? Any comments, questions or observations?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely agree with Clive in terms of, not being able to get that accountability in terms of, people participating. I think from my experience as a journalist, I have observed that there is a sense of, with people thinking that it's of no value. Their participation is of no value because at the end of the day, what's going to happen is, politics. That's the kind of sense that people have, that their vote doesn't matter, that at the end of the day, politics will play its part and, things will not work out as they want or as they would like it to. So I think that's a big problem. And yes, 100% about, what Clive said about elected representatives feeling that they have a special place and that they have a special pedestal, and not understanding that yes, they are representatives of the public, but then they have to take the thoughts and the viewpoints and the issues of the public to be able to represent them well. So that is a big problem where I think as policymakers, we need to kind of make a mechanism where this gap is bridged in some way, and also making people have faith that it's their voice first that is going to be represented by the elected representatives. So I think that is a gray area there which needs to be found a way through about.
Thank you. Clive, did you want to respond?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Clive.
Sorry, thank you for the opportunity. I'll be brief, and I appreciate those comments. Sorry, I missed your name, but from the journalist who just spoke. And I would simply comment as follows. Let me just summarize my presentation by saying this. Does anyone in power want to be held to account in the first instance, and certainly secondly by local populations, local residents in the second? So again, unfortunately, just another question, perhaps a provocative one.
Thank you. Sheelim, if I pronounce your name correctly, you've got your hands raised.
Yeah, Tad is fine. Thanks. I'd want to talk a bit about Harleen's point and Mel's in the chat, especially in regards to the one-off meetings. So for me, the issue I have with it is taking their time, extracted their information, their voice essentially. But what do they see? It's a single one-off meeting and little about the wider picture, the impact, the appreciation itself. There's little investment or togetherness on either side as a result. And the impression that gives off is we do the work and consult you when we think it's appropriate, and we may take your voice into an account as a result. I don't like the word, but it's disempowering for the community.
Yeah, and thank you. And which body do you work for?
I actually work for Collaborate. So we actually work with a lot of the councils on the call right now.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Are there any
including Redbridge? Sorry, I'll just come in. Sorry, it's Ed from Redbridge Council Community Hubs Programme, and I think to pick up on Harleen's very well made point, I think participation has to take account of agency and responsibility. We can end up unintentionally having conversations where we're discussing things over which we don't have sufficient agency, and you create a sense of responsibility for creating a change when actually it's not within the gift of the group of people who are involved in the conversation. So I think it's also interesting. Our guest, I think Delphine was your name, from Belgium, talking about the two hats that you wore of being a campaigner and advocate, but also working as a consultant. I think that there's something about being very clear about when what you are doing is not policy making, but advocacy or campaigning, which I think is a very legitimate and important activity that runs alongside policy making. But being clear that that's different, where your goal is to change the system. So to use an example which I can see coming through on the chat, I would be fully in favour of compulsory voting in order to create a more meaningful voting system, electoral system, and more meaningful mandates for local politicians in particular. That's obviously not something that I'm going to be advancing within my own professional role, my day job, but it is something which would be a legitimate piece of work to do in the community with a different hat on. So I think there's something about being very clear about what the extent of the agency is, and within a local authority context, so far in my experience, there's a challenge of really containing and managing expectations, and still getting enough people to join in, because the properly managed expectations tend to be quite low.
Okay. No, thank you, Ed. And I would encourage you to come back next week and we can unpack compulsory voting a bit more, which is, yeah, I'll share my opinion on it next week. So are there any other observations or comments?
Yes.
Anybody
Can I please respond to Ed on compulsory voting? I think a problem with compulsory voting is the fact that there also exists an option of none of the above. Which is kind of a waste of vote. So I think we need to work on that, in terms of how do we solve that problem, because then the none of the above option is kind of, it's very vague in terms of what do you really want? What can we do? So that is a problematic area that needs to be worked on, I think.
No, thank you. And thank you for all your comments and all your participation. And we've come to the end, really, of this session. That 1 hour goes really, really quickly. So what I would encourage you all to do, if you've not registered already, please register for the workshop next week, where we'll be continuing this same conversation, but we'll be twisting it to look at what are the solutions around some of the problems. In the interim, I will pull together all your votes and all your comments and the highlights of today's discussion. So, and I'll share those with you. So hopefully we'll begin literally on the end of this discussion, what we've had today. And so thank you for participating. And before we go, if I can just go back to Noel, please. And I don't know if you've got any final observations or comments you want to make, Noel, before we end.
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting hearing people's perspectives from different local areas, but also different kind of types of organisations as well. Be that kind of councils, kind of voluntary organisations, campaigners, kind of journalists as well. And I think actually your last question, which is often we look at what's the best to do X, Y, Z, but starting from the weakest actually helps unpick some of the challenges that we need to tackle. And yeah, really looking forward to next week's event. We're starting to look at actually some of the solutions that might help, and sourcing that intel from all of you here today would be really great.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, have a good day, and again, thank you for joining us in our first workshop. See you next week.
Thank you.
Cheers, Darren.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.